everybody. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bacassa. We've got James Johnson back on the line. James, you run and manage and own the KTL Lodge. That's the Katmai Trophy Lodge. But you've had a plethora of experience. We've talked about it. You fished all over the world. And for a long time, you had a lodge down in Belize. And in fact, you're down there now, just across the road, having been there myself at the lodge and at this place, the greenhouse, I call it. But yeah, you're down there fishing. You've got a ton of stuff to share with us on Belize. And I thought it would be really cool to talk about the big three targets that we see on a lot of flat strips. And that's bones, tarpon, and the ever popular permit. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to follow up at the end of the show. You're going to give us some casting tips, some flats casting tips. And I'm going to save a little bit of the information around that, but there's some really cool stuff that, in fact, you taught me, you and your father, on how to get some casts off fast, get a little more accurate, a little different casts, and then getting close to the fish. So I'm excited to talk about that, man. Let's dive in first with your thoughts on the big three. I mean, that's the Grand Slam, right? We were just talking about that, and your wife, gosh, she got a Grand Slam 3 days in a row. So, I mean, kudos to her. That's an awesome feat. But tell me a little bit about, what you see with people and how to kind of prepare yourself for that kind of adventure.
Yeah, I mean, flats fishing definitely holds a special place in my heart. I've been doing it for a long time in the off season of Alaska. It's a great change up from the freshwater. It's just a totally different, it's totally different sport. There's a lot more precision. You're not cast until you see the fish, holding the fly in your hand, see the fish, lay the target out there. And it really lays all of your strengths and weaknesses and then the flaws that you make on a cast right on the table, very visible, as opposed to just when you're out there trout fishing and you're throwing and you're not catching any and you're not necessarily getting those visual cues on what's happening and what's going wrong and why you're not getting those eats. With the flat, It's just all, it's all very in your face about it. You're seeing the fish, you're seeing what they like, what they don't like, and all that. And I find that to be incredible.
That's a great point. I had never really thought about it that way, but yeah, I mean, unless you're sight fishing to a trout and really fishing it hard like that, you don't get to see all that. It's like you don't see your mistakes. You're just not catching fish, right? But in this scenario, it's like, I mean, these guys want to eat. They're saltwater fish. They're predators. They primarily want to eat. And if you're getting in the right location at the right time and you're seeing the fish, like, you make a mistake in that time, it's over.
Yeah. I mean, I think it drives you to want to be better and to see where you need to get better so much more so than any other form of fly fishing, which is, I mean, it's special. And it, on the same token, it will put a lot of people off in that way. I mean, if you don't like failure and you don't like not catching fish, then this flats fishing probably isn't for you. You kind of have to be a little bit of a glutton for punishment.
Yeah. And especially as someone who's, maybe not on the saltwater all the time. A guy like me living in Utah who can do it once or twice a year and that's it. I take a beating. I mean, I go down for a week and it's like by day 5, I'm like, okay, I'm finally starting to feel it and it's over, so it's a commitment for sure.
Yeah. I mean, and it's something that you're always getting better at. And you're exactly right on that. You get most guys that come down or girls that, they're fishing for 6 or, maybe 12 days on the flats a year. And really you're just kind of getting warmed up by the time you're leaving in a lot of those cases. You're just getting your eyes on and being able to pick up those fish in the water, whether that's nervous water tails or the colorations of different fish on different bottoms. I mean, all that is kind of a thing that you're getting used to, acquiring those targets and then, there's so much feel involved with the cast and the presentation on your leads and, so seeing what you can get away with and what you can't. And then, the casting and the wind, there's so many aspects of it that you don't get in, many other parts of our sport, to where if it's something that you're not relatively regularly doing and you're just going out trout fishing in the West, you're not very well adapted for. So it's definitely a difficult transition for a lot of people.
Yeah. Let's dive into that a little bit around bonefish first. I'd love to kind of hear your perspective there. I remember my first few trips, and it was like nervous water. What are you talking about? Nervous water? What is that? And the tailing was easy for me.
Yeah,
You can see a tail. It's
yeah.
very it's abrupt, it's physical in nature, etc. But nervous water is a little harder, and other aspects are a little harder. So maybe talk about first the sighting them, and then your interpretation on how to cast to them.
Yeah, so nervous water is a tricky one, and it can show up in a couple of different ways. So you can get what I call a push, where you have a little bit of, imagine if you have a boat wake coming off of a boat, and that is done by a fish swimming high in the water column. Sometimes it's because he's in shallow water. Oftentimes with a permit, it could be they're swimming high in a little bit deeper water, and they throw a V wake coming off of the body of that fish. Um, so that's a lot of times a little bit easier of a nervous water for most people to see. But what it's hard to do for most people is they always read it wrong, because people see that V wake coming up at them and they think that that's the fish, and they cast on that V wake or ahead of that V wake. And that's
Ah,
typically on the fish, because the wake, just like it would be with a boat, is coming off the back of the fish. So depending upon the size of the fish, you've got a big permit swimming at you. That wake is about 2 feet behind the head of the fish. So people are
mm,
often missing that lead, or not reading the slight direction changes that those fish might be throwing off on the last moment as they're kind of zigging down
yeah,
the front
yeah.
looking for food. But that's a little bit easier one. The other nervous water that you often get, particularly with bonefish, is kind of a shutter, if you will. So
Hmm.
that can be really, really difficult to read for most people that are unfamiliar with the sport, because you look out and your guide is saying nervous water, and there's waves, everywhere. I mean, you got a
Yeah,
little bit of chop, or maybe even white caps or something on a bonefish flat. It's usually just kind of a slight riffle. If it's dead glassy calm, then it's not nearly as hard to spot. But you got that typical little riffle, and then you'll kind of just get a shake in the water, to where the surface water is moving in a different direction than the waves being created by the wind or
yeah.
by the tide. Um, and then that's usually moving to some extent left or right, but you'll just see that bit of water that's reacting differently than all the water around it, and that's just indicating that there's probably fish either swimming or feeding in that zone.
Yeah. I remember that nervous water kind of shake. The way I perceived it when I first saw it for real was like being on a glassy lake, and then a wind comes over top, and you can see a pocket of
Mhm.
wind chatter on the lake. And I saw that in the salt, and then I saw it move.
Yeah.
And I think once you see it two, three times, it really locks in on you. But those first couple times, I mean, I can remember being on with some of your guides, and those guys are like, nervous water. And I'm like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, because I'm
Yeah.
not seeing a damn thing. And, then it's on top of you, and you're like, oh, I see the fish now, but it's almost too late,
Mhm.
at that point. Um, when you, when you're kind of spotting and you're guiding, or you're fishing, how are there things that you're looking for to kind of set yourself up to see nervous water and see those things better?
Well, I mean, to some extent, there are going to be there are going to be areas that are going to be more inclined to have fish making nervous water. So there's a lot of times that you're on a flat where, based off of past experience and the look of the flat, or even better, knowledge of the flat and what you've seen fish doing in there in the past, you'll have a good idea on if you're anticipating to see nervous water or not. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, for example, let's say that you're in the Bahamas and you're fishing a beautiful white sand bonefish flat that's 2.5 feet deep. you're probably not going to see nervous water. Those bonefish are
Mm.
going to be swimming on the bottom. They're going to be feeding in there, moving slow or fast, cruising. But those fish aren't typically going to be shallow enough to be creating nervous water. Now you move in
Hmm.
and you're fishing a flat that's, less than 1.5 feet deep. And in particular, you're expecting the fish to be feeding a little bit heavier on the bottom, like maybe it's a little bit softer bottom, but it doesn't
Hmm.
have to be. Then you're going to start looking a little bit more for nervous water. And the
Okay.
other cues that I'll have is a lot of times the better I can see in the water, like the clearer the water, the better the visibility as far as lighter colored bottom maybe, or a little bit higher sun, the more I'll be looking at a greater distance for fish in the water and a little bit less so nervous water. And a lot of times, if it's in the morning and it's cloudy or something like that, my visibility isn't great. If you're running your own boat and you're with you have a little
Yeah.
bit of control. But like, let's say from the guide's perspective, he's more inclined to go to places where you're more likely to see nervous water. And
Yep.
then as an
Okay.
angler, that's more what you should be looking for. But another I guess this would be a helpful tip is if you're an angler at a new destination or even fishing with a new guide on a new flat that you're unfamiliar with. Let's say you're coming down to Belize and you're pulling onto a bonefish flat day one with Jorge. You say, hey, hey Jorge, what am I expecting to see on this flat? Are you looking for
Mm.
tails? Are you looking for fish flashing? Are you looking for muds? Are you looking for cruising fish? Those sorts of questions are something that sometimes the guides will just, they'll offer up without you asking, but other times they'll just pull onto the flat and they're expecting to see the fish before you anyway, and then try and cue you onto it. But the more
Hmm.
information that you can pull out of your guide on something like that, the quicker you might be able to adapt to then
Yeah, that's a
start
great
seeing those
point.
fish on your own.
Right. Because as soon as they're like, 11 o'clock, you have an idea what you're looking for versus,
Yeah.
I'm looking for everything or I'm looking for nervous water. And he's like, no, you're never going to see nervous water around here kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's great. I love that. And I like how you describe too, like maybe you go into a flat and it's a little bit deeper. You're going to be really seeing the fish, not necessarily nervous water, but that, 50 yards up, there's a big pancake flat that's a lot shallower. You might be looking there for nervous water, but everywhere else you're kind of just spotting fish, etc. So I think those are great tips.
Mhm.
Um, let's do this. You start seeing a fish, right? And we got to start thinking about if I'm seeing nervous water or I'm seeing pushes. One of the things that I learned from you and your father, we spent like, I think it was not even a half a day. We went out to one of the flats and we saw some pushes. And I remember how you guys really talked about the direction of the pushes, especially we were hunting permit and they were changing directions so fast. You could tell it was like going from crab to crab or whatever. And then you guys were repositioning the boat for cast. I wasn't casting at the time, Todd was. But can you talk a little bit about that and how that comes into play as a guide and as an angler?
Yeah. I mean, the fish, permit in particular, bonefish are they're a lot slower moving typically, and they feed slower and then they move in a little bit more consistent directions. Permit are,
Mm-hmm.
they're very erratic fish in a lot of cases. They're typically moving faster. They're typically in a little bit deeper water, and they change directions a lot in the way they swim. That's where you get the traditional method, and for the most part is still kind of the main accepted method of catch them or spook them, cast close to the fish, to where that whole principle basically comes about because you don't know where the fish is going to be a second from now, and you'd rather show them the fly than not. So as that fish is cruising the flat, and I know the spot that you're talking about, we were fishing a handful of years ago. Those
Mm-hmm.
fish are consistently big singles and doubles, and they're waking along and they're pushing a hard V wake like what we're talking about. And that wake might stay up for 200 yards or it might stay up for 20 feet. And then that fish will see a crab. I mean, I suppose it's a little bit my theory, but I think it's an accurate theory. Is what they're doing is they're swimming high in about 3.5, 4 feet of water and fast. That's creating that push. as they're cruising, they're looking for a crab to shoot out of the way of that push and try and run and hide. Then they're going down and they're feeding on said crab, getting
Right. And the
back
push
up.
disappears, right?
Yeah, the push disappears. So it's gone. You don't know where the fish is going to be. He could pop up 40 feet away from there or right back in the same spot and could be moving a totally different direction. So in that case, you know, as you're maneuvering the boat, you're trying to keep the fish in a position to where you can, you have good visibility depending upon how your light is. And then also, almost more importantly with the wakers, is you're trying to keep the fish in a position to where your angler can get a good shot on them with the wind. So you're kind of
Right. I
trying
was
to
just,
play that a little bit upwind, crosswind game, maneuvering, and then not letting that fish go by you. And then hitting that shot as soon as it becomes available and, putting it on the fish.
yeah. And what was real interesting to me too on that trip is we were casting an Avalon,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty heavy weighted fly. And I was having difficulty. And I remember you saying to me, if that's really giving you trouble, Christian, you need to go to a lighter fly because if you're not getting the fly to them, you're not getting a chance. And that really helped me a ton. And I would be interested to hear when you say get the fly close to the fish. What do you mean by close to the fish? Like, what is your priority of fly presentation? Is it closeness? I got to get it down in time. The presentation, how am I presenting it? All those things. Like, could you just talk through those for us?
Yeah, so I mean, above anything else, what I always want to do, and it doesn't matter whether this is a bonefish, a permit, or a tarpon. Now, permit are the hardest to do this to because they move the most erratically of any of the fish. Tarpon move the least erratically, probably, and this is all a generalization. And
Yeah.
different situations and different flats, this can all change. But typically, the permit are the most erratic, the tarpon are the most consistent, and the bonefish are somewhere in the middle. So with tarpon, that's the fish that you throw the biggest lead on. Bonefish, kind of in the middle. And permit, you typically would lean on throwing the closest to the fish because he's the least likely to be where, to continue swimming the
Yeah.
direction you want so that your fly is there. So my
Okay.
number one priority is to always show that fish the fly, no matter what. I don't care if he eats it. It doesn't matter. I'm expecting a lot of fish to not eat the fly. What I want to always make sure I do is make sure that they see that fly and they have to physically do something about it. Whether that's follow the fly, eat the fly, or move out of the way of the fly, they're going to react to my fly.
Okay. What are when you say to see the fly, what are the things are you thinking about to ensure that fish sees the fly?
Yeah, and so that's where your constant, variable is going to be. So a lot of people will say things like, we'll use a permit, for example. They should say they'll say throw 2 to 3 feet in front of the fish. That's pretty common. Throwing, 3 feet in front of the fish. Some people will say hit them on the head. But let's say 3 feet in front of the fish would be your standard lead, if you will. But that's going to be greatly variable. It's dependent upon how much chop there is on the water. If it's glassy calm, you'll probably have to put that fly more like 6, 10, 12 feet in front of him so he won't spook from it. That's going to depend upon how fast your fly sinks. Like, let's say we're in that bay that you're talking about, and the fish are swimming fast, relatively fast, and they're pushing a wake, and they're up on the surface. Now, they're up on the surface, so the fly doesn't need to get down that fast, but you need to put it down far enough in front of them that fly drops down into their cone of vision before they swim by it. So the heavier your fly, the closer you can put to that fish to some extent. The lighter your fly, like let's say you needed to throw, it's pretty calm, and you need to throw a bead chain eye fly to not spook them. Let's just say, for example, that bead chain eyed fly, you might have to lead them 8 feet, where if you have small lead eyes or medium lead eyes and a foot of chop, you can put it 3 feet in front of them.
Yep.
If the fish is moving faster and more in a straight line, I'll usually put a little bit longer lead on them. The slower the fish is, like let's say the fish is stopped, not moving at all, I'll usually put it closer to them. So, let's say in an ideal world, a couple feet away from them. If they're bonefish and they're just kind of feeding and tailing in the same spot and really not moving at all, and to some extent permit as well, I'll put the fly right in front of them
Yeah,
and a little
yeah,
past them so that fly is going down into their cone of vision right here. If you're landing 2 or 3 feet short of that fish or 2 or 3 feet in front of the fish, but they're not moving and they're looking down, a lot of times they won't see that fly, and you'll cast and cast, and then
yeah.
that third cast, maybe they'll start to know something's going on, hearing that fly land and you picking up
Yes.
off the water, and then you spook that fish before you ever showed them the fly. I would
Mhm.
rather you put that fly on that bonefish's head and then risk spooking him, but risk spooking him on that first shot. Because every time you're throwing at that fish and you're not showing him the fly, he's going to get a little bit more wary. He's going to have a little bit more time to hear the boat or see you or see the
Yeah,
boat or hear the fly land, or you'll splash a little bit as you're picking it up. All those things will create spooking fish before he ever had a chance to eat your fly.
yeah, yeah. I love that because you're really talking about like building your situational awareness, right? Of like
Mm-hmm.
what are the elements that are going around, and you'll build that over time. But you also gave some guidelines of like, these are the things you have to think about. You got to think about the depth of the fish, how you're going to present to them, their kind of vision, calmness of the water, how those all come into play. And those are all a lot of variables that you can really control. It's just being aware of them at the start, I think, is
It's
really important.
Yeah, it's just a thing that people don't think about. And the same thing would go to, like on your question, like you should know how fast your fly is going to sink. You should drop your
Mm-hmm.
fly in the water next to your boat, next to the boat. You should count how long it takes to the bottom. You should have a base idea of how long that fly is going to take to get down on a given flat. If you've got a school of permit feeding on the bottom in 4 feet of water, like you don't fish them the same way as if they're up on the top. If you have
Mm-hmm.
a light fly, that's probably not the right fly for one, but ideally you'd know the circumstance and you'd go heavier, but you want a fly that can drop down and you can fish it into their zone,
Yeah.
um, which is a totally different circumstance than if they're just sitting there floating, finning, um, in a hole or something, for
Yeah. Yeah.
instance.
I can remember. This is a prime example. I was down at X Flats. You were just there a couple of weeks ago at X Flats with Jesse and those guys, and we went out in the morning, and it was just blowing like crazy. The weather was absolutely terrible for fishing, and we saw a permit, and it was cruising along, and I like just tried to flub this backhand cast out there as best I could, and of course the wind took it, and it piled all up, and it was 8 feet at least away from this fish, and I thought, there's absolutely no way that's nothing. And sure enough, that permit bum rushed that fly. I mean, it stopped and did like almost a full 90-degree turn and like bum rushed that fly. Now, I didn't catch the fish. It spooked after that, but like I didn't even think I had a chance of that fish reacting. But because of the circumstances of the wind, the chop on the water, et cetera, and how I got it out there, I had a reaction, right? If that was a dead calm day, that cast made so much noise and reaction, that fish probably would have been gone forever. But it just kind of shows you, like you said, depending on the situation, you're going to get a different reaction. So be prepared and understand what you're going into. Yeah, I really like that. Let's do this. You talked a little bit about tarpon. We haven't talked too much about that, but they are a little less erratic, and the feeding idea is sometimes a little different as well. So talk about your tips there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wide variety, like with other fish as well, of the tarpon that you're going to fish for. We'll classify the two main categories to where people are fishing for tarpon. Is you have the juvenile fish, which are often associated with the mangroves. They don't necessarily have to be in mangroves. They can be in channels. They can be on flats. But let's say your mangrove estuary type environments. Um, those fish are typically very aggressive. You kind of just want to show them the fly. The leads, again, they're usually moving a little bit farther, for the fly. They're usually moving a little bit straighter line. So a lot of times I'll throw a little bit longer lead. Like I wouldn't typically want to put a cast on a juvenile tarpon right on its head, 2 or 3 feet out, on him. But 4 or 5, much, much more so in kind of that appropriate range. Um, I'll strip it a lot of times kind of in a similar-ish sort of manner for a lot of the fish, but I'll start moving the fly pretty slow, with a pretty slow strip, just to kind of keep it in that general zone in front of the fish and let him approach on it. So a lot of
So
times
until
I
you
might,
see a reaction kind
yeah,
of
so
thing.
I'll
Is that
throw
what
it
you're
a
saying?
little bit past him. I mean, and by a little bit, I mean maybe a foot. As he's cruising up, I'll put it over here, and he gets up. I'm moving it pretty slow, and I want this fly to essentially intercept directly ahead of the fish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then as that fish sees the fly and engages, he'll flare up. You want to, I'll typically speed that fly up a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You kind of play with the strip to see what they want. Sometimes they like it moving pretty fast. Sometimes they like it moving a little bit slower. I don't usually get really choppy in the strips like you might with brown trout. I'll usually keep it relatively long, but there's a little bit up to discretion there.
Yeah.
Um, but you strip it, they get on it, you speed it up a little bit, then you feel them, and you hit them. Everybody's heard of a tarpon set, hard strip
Yep.
set. Keep your rod down. Once you hook that fish, you keep that, keep your rod tip down, pressure on. A lot of times those fish are fought pretty much on the strip. You don't necessarily need to put them on the reel. The larger the fish, then you get a little bit more into that wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Where a
Yeah.
lot of people mess up with those is they'll hook, um, an 8, 10, 12, 20, 30 pound tarpon. It almost doesn't matter. You can almost put this category all the way up to 40 pounds. And a lot of people will hook that fish on a, 9 or
Nice
10
strip
weight
set.
rod, and you have quite a bit of strip on the deck, and you'll hit them and strip, and the fish will jump right away, and maybe you survive that jump or maybe you don't. But let's say you survive that jump, and then we sacrifice tension for trying to put them on the reel.
Mm.
So
Okay.
instead of continuing to strip that fish in, people start reeling, and then the fish jumps again. You have a little bit of slack in there. The fish comes off.
Gone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
But anyway, I guess that's kind of a good basis for the smaller ones. The bigger tarpon, your adult migratory tarpon. Obviously, there's a lot of variance in how people will fish for those in locations. Like
Yeah.
Costa Rica is obviously a thing that comes to mind for people, but we won't kind of get into that. But we'll use your Florida Keys as a prime example of what people think about with migratory tarpon. Those fish are big, they're old, they've seen a lot of flies, and to some extent your casts need to be a little bit more thought through and a little bit longer of a lead. So those fish are typically swimming in a relatively straight direction. You have a chain of fish coming at you on a flat, let's say. Again, I would put that cast in front of them and across them. If the fish are swimming deeper, I would put it more in front of them to give the fly a little bit of time to come down. But tarpon are also quite willing to come up in a lot of instances.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but let's say I would probably do a 6, 8 foot lead, putting it across in front of those fish a few feet, move the fly slow as they come up. I might give it some little ticks. I might just kind of bounce it along through there, and then I might glide it. A lot of the guys in the Keys are doing the worm thing and the little two-handed strip, which can be super effective as well. I think a lot of that, as much as anything else, is just to keep anglers from being able to trout set. It's really good at that. It's hard to trout set if you're not holding the
It is. Yeah. If it's under
rod.
your arm.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, it's a really fun way to fish. Obviously, there's nothing like watching a 60 to 80 pound fish come up and engulf your fly.
Oh yeah. It's absolutely insane. It's one of my favorites to see.
Yeah, it's so cool. So cool.
Um, let's do this. Those are the three species. Let's talk about, I think, stripping techniques and your thoughts on that. Let's use three flies. So I have a shrimp pattern, a crab pattern, and a baitfish pattern. How do you vary your stripping techniques and why?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got the big three and we've got those three different flies. So we'll just I'll stick with bonefish permit tarpon for each of those to start anyway. So,
Okay.
a shrimp you can move a little bit faster than a crab. So shrimp and crabs can be used for both permit and tarpon. We'll start with bonefish and shrimp. So again, I'll usually put it out, in front of that fish. If the fish is tailing, if the fish is tailing and not moving, maybe I'll put that fly a foot in front of him. I'm going to let that fly kind of sink into the zone, depending upon the sink rate of my fly and the depth that that fish is tailing in. You know, maybe it's a 10-pound fish tailing in Hawaii in thigh deep water. It might take a little longer for it to get down.
Right,
If
right,
it's,
right.
you know, in 4 inches of water and its back's out, you're pretty much down right away. But anyway, so you throw it out. I'm letting that fly sink a little bit while I'm making sure that my line is tight and straight. A lot of times when people cast, something that they don't think about, your line isn't necessarily tight and straight. So you want to make sure you get any slack that might be in there from your cast out
Right.
immediately.
So you're pulling the slack out before knowing that my fly's not moving because I'm
Yeah.
just getting slack. And then you're at that point where you're like, okay, next strip, I'll probably move my fly. So maybe you pause or maybe you do impart action.
Right. Yeah. So in
Is
a
what you're
lot of,
saying.
in cases with a lot of people, you're throwing it and there's a little slack. So you're stripping kind of right away with a little bit of a long, slow strip. And what that's doing is, letting the fly sink, getting that slack out. If you know that your fly landed totally straight, maybe you'll just kind of hold it tight and let it sink. But typically it's always going to be with a little bit of a strip.
Mm-hmm.
So you're letting the fly dive down. The fish sees the fly. Now that bonefish sees your shrimp. I might start it a little bit faster. If he swims at it really quickly, then I'm probably going to speed it up even more. If he goes at it kind of slow and timidly, then I might bounce it a few times and then kind of drop it to the bottom and hopefully eats it there. I mean, it's all of what you're doing, at an advanced level anyway, is you're reading the fish, seeing how he reacts, and then you're moving the fly accordingly to how you think you want. The more aggressive the fish comes at it, the more I'll probably move it quicker.
Yeah.
The more timid, the little bit slower. If he's casually following along behind it slow, I'll probably stop the fly and let it sit on the bottom and see if he continues up to it before I move it again. Let him close that gap.
Yeah. I think of it as like it's a fleeing animal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I was a shrimp, how does a shrimp react? A shrimp, bam, 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 pulse, 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 trying to get away if fish is close. But like you said, if fish is a little further away, I might pulse, 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 and then try to hide, camouflage.
Yep.
And then it comes in the sight again. It sees me, pulse, 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 pulse. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's the basic principle. The more aggressive he's following it, the more I might just flee, 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 flee. But you get to some extent and they're not eating it on that continuous flee, then you might try the dive and hide approach again.
Right. Okay.
And then you can kind of intermingle those two plays, but that's pretty much it. You have, slow, high, fast. With a shrimp on for a permit, it's pretty much the same thing. I'll usually throw it out in front of them, sink. Some guys like the real short kind of choppy strips with it. I don't typically do that. I'll typically just go long and slow, kind of letting it dive into the zone. Reaction, strip, strip, strip. Maybe I dive it, maybe I don't, depending upon the fly that I have on. And then just kind of vary in between a little bit faster and a little bit slower speed potentially. With a crab on permit, it kind of just depends upon what crab that you're fishing. And then it's all situational. Like some of the crab patterns, you can't fish fast at all because they spin. And that's something that you should know when you have a crab, especially one that you're unfamiliar with and you haven't fished. Throw it in the water. Move the crab at various speeds and see what it does. If that crab spins at all, then you know that you can't fish at that speed. If it spins at any speed, then you either need to
adjust
move your
your
legs
fly
around,
or
adjust
something.
the fly.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just no good. I mean, a lot of commercial flies are just not tied well. They're not heavy enough, or the hook's too stout, or the body's glued down slightly, so it makes it want to flip upside down. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that can happen that make the fly not ride true. But you want to make sure that your fly rides true. If your fly will ride true at any speed, people don't think of crabs swimming fast, but in particular, blue crabs, they swim quite fast. Like your normal flats crab, they're very good swimmers, and they'll move they can swim on that flat faster than you're going to strip the fly. Now, I don't think that that's an advisable move in most cases, but you definitely can move the fly faster. Especially if you're throwing at smaller fish. The bigger fish usually like the crabs moving a little bit slower. So a lot of times, again, you'll throw the fly out in front of them, you're letting it dive, you're trying to catch their attention. I'll usually give it a couple strips that are relatively slow to maybe medium pace. And then if they don't eat it in those couple strips, then a lot of times, at least if I have the depth to be able to do it and a relatively fast sinking fly, then a lot of times I'll let it sink at that point.
Uh-huh.
And I won't necessarily let it sink forever. I don't usually, if there's grass or rock or something that the fly will get caught in, I don't like to let the fly get all the way to the bottom. Just because I don't like it to get hung up on anything. I'd rather keep fishing, because as soon as you catch a blade of grass, that fish is gone.
It's gone. Yeah. Okay.
But you'll dive it. And then if that fish starts to turn away at all, I mean, this is, again, assuming you can see the fish well enough to do that, then you'll start moving the fly again and hope he comes back on and eats it. The only tricky part with that is that people miss a lot of fish doing that, which is why when we had the lodge in Belize, I pushed a lot of people towards fishing shrimp. Is I thought for your average trout fisherman, it was a lot easier for him to catch a permit throwing a shrimp than it was for him to throw a crab and let that thing dive. Because when you're not totally tight on the fly and a fish eats it, you don't necessarily feel them, and people miss a lot. So a lot of times when you're letting that fly drop, you're actually giving it that strip set based upon the reaction of the fish. Mm-hmm. So you see him
not necessarily the feel.
Yeah, not necessarily the feel, and that's tough for a lot of people. And people miss them, and they also end up breaking quite a few off that way, it seems, but definitely miss a lot of eats. But you're looking for just a little reaction of the tail. Same with bonefish to some extent. You'll just see them kind of kick their tail. If you can see them well enough, you'll see the permit a lot of times will flare their front
gill
fins.
plates.
Yeah,
their fins.
Gill plates. Okay. Yeah, but you'll see them kick their fins out, kick their tail. That's neat. Set the hook.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I ran into that with going between redfish and sheep's head. A redfish, big gill flare, really easy to understand when they eat. But a sheep's head is more like a permit. Like, it'll come in really slow, and then usually there's just a little flicker of something going on, whether it's a tail or a slight movement and a grubbing, and that's the eat. And like the first few I had, even though I seen them, you would get like, oh, he's eating. You're like, what? He's eating. It looks like he's just looking at it.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So you got, next up is streamers. Or bait fish patterns, right?
Yeah. Bait fish patterns. Bait fish patterns, we're talking about tarpon. You're not really, there are some isolated cases where people are catching bonefish and permit on bait fish. Obviously the predator species that we're not really going to get into, but jacks and kudas and stuff. But jacks are really big on bait fish patterns. With a jack, you're typically just throwing it and stripping it as fast as you can. There's not a lot of play to that. With tarpon, it depends upon the situation. If let's say you have a school of tarpon feeding on a big school of sardines or pilchers or whatnot, and they're actually busting, I'll usually throw it and strip it pretty fast.
Okay. You're trying to differentiate from the pack, though. At that time, I would
you're
assume,
trying
right?
to just look like a minnow darting out of that pack, and that's usually what triggers the bite. In a lot of other cases, when you're fishing tarpon or with an EP minnow type thing, a lot of times I'll still just throw it out in front, that kind of long and slow, let them see it, and then just kind of a little bit dart away.
Okay. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's
pretty straightforward.
Pattern.
Yeah.
I think the big things that I found are, these are predatory fish. You don't strip the fly to them; it's away from them. That's a big one.
That's a big thing, especially with tarpon. It's bigger with tarpon than anything else in this group. Is tarpon don't, in my experience, don't like the fly coming at them. You can kind of come across them, especially if it's like a quartering to or shot, that sort of thing. Like, you can come across them a little bit, but that fly better not swim at them. Bonefish, if they're seeing any kind of pressure, like we've done trips to Cuba the last few years, and those Cuban bonefish, they'll pretty much eat any bonefish fly they see. So they don't really care if it swims at them. They'll spin around and eat it. But in most cases with a smart bonefish, they don't need a fly coming at them. Permit, oddly enough, with his erratic and, with the reputation of not biting as much as they do, they're the ones that respond to a going away shot the best. Like if you have permit swimming away, it's definitely not my favorite shot. If they're swimming away, but if they're slowly swimming away or feeding away or tailing away, and you can get the fly 3 or 4 feet past them and a little bit off one of the sides or another, to where it's kind of coming back as they're going forward, that'll actually trigger them to spin around and eat it.
Yeah.
Okay. Not all the time.
That makes sense.
As good as permit do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Very cool. Let's do this. We talk about seeing them, putting the fly in front of them, types of fly, returns, fighting. Let's just go right down the list. I want to hear your different perspectives on the fights. How do you handle them once you get them hooked?
Yeah, so typically, with bonefish, the fighting's pretty straightforward. A lot of the salmon steelhead guys anyway, and some of the trout guys will talk about having low rods. So some trout guys talk about high rods and whatnot. But definitely with bonefish, high rod is the way to go. Because the only thing that they have to break you off on, you're not worried about jumps and them throwing the hook so much as you have, maybe rocks, grass, and mangrove shoots.
Old
mangrove
trap
shoots
or
being
something.
A big one.
Yeah.
So you're worried about them getting you on something that's on the bottom or on a mangrove shoot. So you want to hook them. You get that rod up as high as possible when fighting them. Typically, that first run on a bonefish is just going to burn out a bunch of line and go straight away. And then they'll kind of come back in a little bit. And then depending upon the size of the fish, you usually get, 2 or, another 1 or 2 good runs out of them after that. And in a lot of cases, the fight's a little bit anticlimactic in that, except for if you're hooking them in a place that has a lot of mangrove shoots. And then it's going to be just a real high rod. And then you're going to either try and maneuver the boat around, as a guide or as an angler with the guide maneuvering the boat around. Or a lot of times that'll involve running through the mangrove shoots and trying to untangle it and weaving rods through. And that can get pretty darn exciting. But it's pretty straightforward. You hook them, they run, rod high, and then, take it as they give it to you.
When you talked about like rod high and taking them when it gets you, you're winding the reel, right? Like what about clearing your line? What's your technique on clearing your line? That's important for, I think, all 3 of these.
Yeah, right. That's applicable to all 3. Clearing your line is very important. A lot of people lose a lot of fish in that whole process. So we'll start with, again, all these saltwater fish are going to be hooked with a strip set. So you strip set. Now you're like this. At that point, the fish is on, you feel him. Once he's on, you come up with the rod. Now, typically what I like to see people do is all 3 of these fish, particularly bonefish and permit, when you hit them, usually they turn and run. And then if they're of, good size anyway, whether that's a permit, if they're above 4 or 5 pounds, if it's a bonefish, if they're above, 3 or 4 pounds, about the same, that fish will probably clear all the fly line you have out. Even if you're a really good caster and you have, most of the fly line out, that fish is going to take all that, probably go into your backing. So at that point, you'll hook them, you'll come up, and then I usually don't like to hold the line with my rod hand unless need be. So then you'll spread hands apart and you'll let the line as it's coming off of the deck go through your left hand and then out the rod. And what that does is it keeps it from wrapping around the reel handle or the butt or anything like that. While you're doing that, that fish is ideally running. You're looking down at your line and you're making sure that you're not standing on it. You're making sure it's not caught on the gear bag in the bottom of the boat. If you have a good fishing partner, that's something that they can keep watch out for to some extent too. And then obviously knots in the line can be an issue as well. Again, if you have a knot in your line, a lot of times you as an angler, there's not much you can do about it. But if you're in Mexico, there's probably an assistant guide. Let him know. He can try and get that knot out real quick. If possible, your fishing partner can try and get that line out. But then you let him go. Worst case, there's still a knot in your line. A lot of times that'll go through your guides, or a couple times this year. If it's really bad, you can actually take the top of your rod off.
Your rod off,
yeah. but yeah, so that's basically clearing the line. You want to make sure you're not standing on it. Another thing that really helps for that is being barefoot, or if you get
Mm-hmm.
sunburned real easily and you don't like to do that, maybe wearing a thin pair of socks.
That's
Um,
what I do. Yep.
yeah, that's a good way to make sure that you're not standing on your line. It seems if you're on a flats boat, you're on the front deck and you're wearing shoes, you're just almost always standing on your line. I don't know how
You're
that works,
aching.
but you just are.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you are. It's aching
yeah,
for punishment for sure. And then the other one is when you take your shoes off, don't put them right there in the well. Move them to the
yep,
back of the boat
yeah. Put them back
because it's
there
another
by the seat.
clear
Or,
everything out, man. That's your partner's program right there. Like I'm going to move everything and help you manage your line. So, all right. So we talked about bonefish, permit, a little bit different.
yeah, permit. It's similar to bonefish, and but even a little bit less climatic in a lot of ways. So
Mm-hmm.
you'll typically hook a permit. They're in a little bit deeper water. They can be up in the mangroves like that, but it's not really common. When you're the only places where you're really worried about permit breaking you off um, is if there's a lot of rocks, a lot of coral. They can be out on the
Mm-hmm.
reef. Um, the little trick that you can do if they're wrapping you on something, kind of the same thing with bonefish, is you can go real light on the drag, and that can keep them from breaking you off while you're waiting to unwrap them and untangle them. A lot of times, if I
Mm-hmm.
know I'm going to be on a really, really rocky flat, instead of pulling extra hard on them, I'll fish it lighter, and I'll want them to run off the flat. You go through and make sure your line's all not on the rocks and get out with the boat, and then you can crank that drag down and
Then
pull
you
on them.
crank them out. So you're saying I want to clear the danger zone, the
Yeah.
fish from the danger zone.
Yeah, I want the
Let
fish
them
to run
run.
out of
Let
the
them run.
danger zone, and then I want to follow them out without applying too much pressure. Because if they're rubbing you, if your line rubs up against a rock and it's under heavy tension, he breaks you off. If it rubs
Yeah.
up against a rock and the tension's relatively light, then then that fish is going
Hmm.
on. The line's just sliding through there. It's not a big
Yeah.
deal. So you want to
Okay.
hit them. You want to make sure the hook's buried good. Not that permit are very hard. You don't need to tarpon set them. They've got a nice, relatively soft mouth, but you get them. You got your line tight, and usually they stay hooked pretty good. You clear those obstacles. But in most cases where you're fishing for permit, there's not too many issues. Guys that are losing them are typically either breaking them off on the strip set, which is easy to
Yeah.
do if it's a big fish and it's turning as you're setting. So
Yeah.
that's something to be aware of. I broke a couple off this year where they were just grabbed it coming at me, and I gave them a good long set to try and hit them because they were, I wasn't tight and they were coming at me. But as I did that, they had already turned and wow, break
Yeah.
you off. But anyway, people usually lose them there, and then outside of that, it's just kind of being impatient. You fight the fish, and you're usually in pretty good odds, but still kind of high rod. Only thing you're worried about is on the bottom until you get the fish in at the end of the fight. Then you can start going left, right to try and wear them out a little faster. With tarpon,
Whole nother story.
whole nother story. Yeah, it's a whole nother story. They're very acrobatic fish. They jump a lot. You
Hard bill
typically
mouth.
They've got
Right.
a very hard mouth, so you have to hit them harder. In a lot of cases, that's not as hard as people think it is, but you still want to hit them pretty good. Maybe hit them with a little bit of a rod low, down, basically fight them with rod tip in the water.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever direction they're facing, I would always want you to be pulling the opposite direction. So if the fish is facing left, you're pulling right. If he's facing right, you switch it over, you're pulling left, pulling
Mm-hmm.
against the body of that fish, trying to turn him, turn him, turn him. And I don't really care whether that's a little one or a big one. That's kind of the maneuver in
Yeah.
my mind.
And
As that fish jumps too, it's a pretty well-known thing people talk about. You want to bow a little bit. I don't like that to be full slack. I like to just soften up on them and let them jump and whatnot.
yeah.
Um, but the bigger the fish, the more important that is. If it's a 10-pounder, it's not all that important. If it's a 120-pounder and you've got them on, 16-pound class tippet, then it's very important. But
Yeah.
the shock from those big head shakes is what gets you. That's what breaks you off. So
Okay.
absorbing that shock by lowering that rod in and giving them a little bit less tension is advantageous for that.
Yeah. One thing about tarpon that I feel like, and I'd be interested to hear your feedback is getting them in quick is really important to me. Like I feel like I don't want to horse around with them. The more I let them run, it's just like the odds of losing them get super, super high. Whereas some of those other fish, like if one or two runs, like I feel like I've always got a good hook set, and it's, you know, it's fathomable to make a couple runs and be okay with it. But with tarpon, it's like, gosh, the faster I can get them in, the better. I just want to get this over with because my success goes up. Is that your theory? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can land tarpon a lot faster than people think, and I don't have nearly the tarpon experience of a lot of those, a lot of the Florida guys and whatnot. I mostly permit fish. I've done a lot more bone fishing and permit fishing than tarpon fishing, but I've done enough to feel like I can talk about it to some extent. Yeah, I mean, I'd land a tarpon very quickly, especially if it's, if you're talking a 15, 20 pound tarpon. Like I caught a tarpon last week that was probably in that, like a 15-pound fish on an 8 weight, and I bet you I landed it in, I don't know, 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
It's just
super
like
fast.
yarding that
Yeah.
thing in as fast
Yeah.
as you can.
Didn't
Right.
put it on the reel. Basically you strip them in as they're jumping a few times. I mean, you can do a lot. You can do a lot with 50-pound and a 20-pound break. A lot more than people think you can. And the harder you pull on those fish, almost the better, the better they seem to stay on, especially with the smaller ones. Now the bigger fish, to some extent, it's kind of the same thing. Like a really good tarpon angler, like I've had buddies that I've fished with in the past that, they'll hook a, 100-pound type fish, and you'll have a boat side in, 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, that fish is landed. And they're, those guys are pulling on those fish harder than, somebody like you could ever imagine doing. I mean, you're just freaking reeling on those things.
Right. And it's all legs too. I mean, it's like amazing how they can be so powerful.
Yeah, you're doing it with legs and full body movement as opposed to the arms. You're not bringing that rod back behind you really at all. It's just, tight, relatively tight drag, crank down on them, pull back, crank down on them, pull back. You're chasing them with the boat as well. Like that's key. That's something that guides in some areas are really good at. And a lot of guides, especially if they don't fish a lot of tarpon, whether that, whatever country that you're in, they don't, those guys don't fish a lot of tarpon, then they'll be a little bit less inclined to chase them with the boat, and your fight times go way up, and then your odds of landing that fish go down. So if you can, you try and chase them with the boat, keep them close, and pull on them. Because when they're close and you're really getting that cross body pull, that's when you're breaking the fish down and you're tiring them out. And it's probably something that you've heard of. It's something that people talk about a lot, which is the tarpon can actually breathe air from the air as well as from the water. So they'll come up when it gets close to the end of the fight and they're starting to get gassed. They come up and they'll roll, and that gives them essentially like a shot of adrenaline, and brings another 5-10 minutes into that fight in a lot of cases. So when you get them close and you start to get them tired, make sure you're pulling down and you're pulling hard, and you're keeping them from coming up on the top. You're keeping them from rolling, and then you can break them a lot faster.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it is a lot of that's like I think it was Keith Roseness I interviewed, and he's like, a lot of it is, kind of breaking the will of the fish at that point, and really letting them know you're there, you're hammering them.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta pull on them, and and it's a fine balance, because when you're pulling on, again, we'll just say we're fishing 20-pound break, 20 pounds of pressure. If you've ever pulled on a fly rod with 20 pounds of pressure, that's a freaking lot of pressure. I mean, you're not really ever coming anywhere close to that, but it's the shock from the quick runs and the jumps that do it. Mm-hmm. So the better you are at reading when the fish is going to do those things, and then being able to lean in with your body, lowering your arm and dipping the rod to kind of absorb the shock of that initial burst. And then after they get that initial burst, then putting that pressure back on them to turn them back, and then doing that again and again, and turning their head and turning their head. And that, I mean, that's how you break the will of a fish. I mean, that's how you beat a tarpon up pretty quick.
Yeah, and it is those shock scenarios. Like, for example, you're fighting a tarpon and it's running deep, and you can see the line coming up. You're like, this thing's going to jump. I mean, like reading those scenarios and understanding what to do was really, I think, pretty important.
Yeah. And I think what you get a lot too, let's say it's whoever, but it's some guy from Colorado who has never, hooked a tarpon or has only hooked 8 or 9 tarpon. You hook that fish. Now maybe you've lost 4 or 5. You've had them jump off and you fought them. Now you're scared to lose them and you're scared to put pressure on them. And that's like a compounding factor. And that's when you get a lot of guys that are talking about, being in Mexico and hooking this 80-pound fish and pulling on him for, fighting him for an hour and a half and losing it. That's, you hear those stories.
Well, it should have been in a while ago.
Right. Yeah. Because they were scared, they were afraid to pull on that fish the way that they should be.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of that's angle too, right? I mean, like you said, I might be pulling on the fish, but if I have my rod tip angle really low, then I'm going to keep them lower in the water column and hopefully not see as much jumping, et cetera, et cetera.
And if you're not close to him, like if you're pulling on the fish and he's 100 yards into your backing, you're not pulling on that fish.
Yeah, you got so much stretch in that line. It's like, what all are you doing? All right.
Yeah.
That's a great point. All right, let's do this. We went through all those phases. We said we were going to talk about a tip around casting, flats casting. So let's talk about the quickness scenario, the variety of casts that you need to be able to have, and then the closeness of how you're locating your fly. We kind of covered that, but we can cover that again.
Yeah. So speed is a very important thing for you to keep in mind when casting. Like you'll see a lot of guys that aren't saltwater anglers that might have a very pretty, classic high 10 to 2 type of cast that maybe takes to get their full distance takes 4 or 5 false casts to get out, and that might be fine. That's great for a lot of people in a lot of instances, but it's not very ideal for saltwater situations. When you're fishing on the flats, it's always windy, and the casts are going to come, you're not in a river, so they can come from any direction, and you need to be prepared for that. And then the faster you can get your fly out, from your hand, your starting point, you're standing there looking for a fish, to, let's call it 60 feet, the better. If you can do that in 1 false cast, incredible. If it takes you 3, that's fine. If it takes you 5, that's something you need to work on. But you drop it, typically it'll kind of be a little bit of a roll cast to get it out and up, pick it up, maybe 1 false cast, 2 false casts, and you're at, 50, 60 feet accurately in an ideal world.
Yeah. And you're not false casting to that distance, but you're shooting to that distance.
You're shooting to that distance.
Right.
And in most of your saltwater fishing, either whether you're wading, you'll try and position yourself to some extent upwind. And then when you're flats fishing, a lot of times the guides are going to try to give you a sort of downwind or crosswind shot. And that's great. You kind of play with it. A couple practice casts, if you're unfamiliar with it when you get on the boat, might be a good thing. Depending upon the angle you're seeing and how high off the water you're releasing that cast, the more wind drift you might see. So, you got to figure that there's always going to be a little bit of that. What I like to do, as opposed to a high, traditional kind of dry fly trout cast, I find it's a lot easier for people to cast in the high winds or into the wind if they actually take the cast down and they throw a little bit of more of a sidearm cast. You get that fly a little bit lower to the water and it unfolds lower to the water. You're going to have less time for that wind to play it. That becomes particularly important when you're throwing into the wind. So you go for your into the wind casts. I always say that you don't want to necessarily aim at the water, but you want to aim just above the water. So if you're casting, you've got a school of permit that are 30, 40 feet into the wind and it's blowing 12 miles an hour. If you have a nice, pretty overhead cast that you throw and your fly unfolds, 7, 8 feet above the water because you're standing up on the high deck of a flats boat, that wind is going to take the fly and it might drift it 10, 12 feet and you're totally out of the zone.
8 feet of exposure versus 3 feet or 5 feet of exposure.
Right.
I mean,
so you take that casting angle down with a little bit of sidearm, and then you stop your back cast up a little bit higher, and your forward cast down a little lower. So you take that line from being a flat line to angle down slightly So it actually
Mm-hmm.
unfolds and then drops into the water. In an ideal world, that'd be a foot above the water, or 6 inches above the
Right.
water. You don't want to pile drive it in there, but you want it to unfold and drop, and that will just help with your accuracy dramatically when fishing to those fish.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Let's do this. Let's maybe set some goals for people if they're, say, like me, living in the States, they don't have a lot of salt water. Like if I was going to go and practice my casting, what would be some of the goals? I would assume, you know, I want to be able to make a cast within 2 back casts. That's like a goal. I would want to practice my sidearm, like lower casts, and like you said, casting at an angle with wind. Is there anything else that you could kind of think about? Like, hey, maybe this is a good activity for you to work on.
Yeah, so one of the most important things that you could learn, and I would utilize it a lot in freshwater as well, but a lot of freshwater people don't think about and or do this, is a good backhanded cast. And not just be able to
Mm-hmm.
cast backhanded, but also be able to backcast accurately. And what I mean when I say that is everybody knows you have your traditional four-handed cast, right? You come back, you come forward, you shoot it. Now a back cast, the way I'll typically do it is I'll open my stance up a little bit and I'm trying to throw this way. So I'll cast essentially the same as my four-handed cast, but I'm casting like I'm casting back behind me. And then I come forward and I release on my back cast as opposed to my four-handed cast.
Yeah, it's the same. I treat it like the same cast. I'm really aiming at my forward cast, but when I'm looking back, I'm
Yeah,
releasing. I mean,
right. It's the same cast. It's people struggle with it because they try to make it more complicated than it is. But essentially, all you're doing is you're open your stance up so you can see your back cast
yep,
comfortably. And then you make the same cast that you did before, but you release it on the opposite end to throw it out
exactly.
at, to throw it at your 1, 2, and 3 o'clock directions without hooking the guide and the other client, and your other angler in the boat.
Right.
So that's invaluable. I mean, that's going to give you an extra 30, 40% on the number of shots you're going to get on a saltwater trip. Just being able to cast with that variable wind direction. So when the wind is blowing in on your right shoulder hard, or the fish just happen to show up where you're not necessarily expecting them, or that's where the good light is, you can make that cast. And a
Yeah.
good saltwater angler, and even a non-good, an unexperienced saltwater angler, it doesn't take a ton of practice to where that cast should be almost as good, if not as good, as your four-handed
Mm-hmm.
cast.
Yeah.
So I would say that that's definitely a priority on things to practice. And if you're unfamiliar with a double haul or you don't know how to double haul, that's definitely something that you should go online and look up and
Yep.
and practice before you go on a saltwater trip. And those two things will greatly increase your odds of success.
Yeah. And what's so funny too, because I do this. I mean, I'm a big offender. When you backcast, I say, and I hear other people say, oh, I just don't seem to have the strength in my arm when I'm backcasting. And it's because you're overpowering your pull to that back pass, just like you would overpower a forward cast. So when you practice it, it's really important, like you said, to just get that rhythm down. It shouldn't feel any different. It's the same cast, right? It's just the release
Yeah.
mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. Typically, people are a little bit uncomfortable with the process and unfamiliar with the process of doing that because they haven't practiced it or done it as much. And then they try and really, power in and
Yeah.
then, end up
Your
throwing
wrist
tailing loop,
breaks and
overload the
everything else.
rod,
Yeah.
your form goes to crap where really it's the same cast, it's the same power that you're seeing on the other end. It's just releasing the opposite direction. And the other thing that people struggle with a lot on it too, and I get because you're not ever used to aiming where it's at back behind you, but it's the accuracy on that back cast is something that
Mm-hmm.
you really need to think about.
Yeah. Wow, cool. No, those are great tips, James. Once again, thanks for being on the show, man. You always provide a ton of information for us. And one of the things I've always admired you for is your versatility. You got a ton of it. You're an awesome trout angler and a great saltwater angler. It's been great seeing all your successes on social media and wish you the best. But thanks again for coming back, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right, you got it. We'll talk to you guys soon. If you want to check out James, go check him out online. James, what's your Instagram handle?
Yeah, it's James Johnson, but instead of an S, it's a Z.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
And then if you guys want to get a hold of James to maybe go visit the Katmai Trophy Lodge in Alaska, just go to the Katmai Trophy Lodge website, and the address is James.
Yeah, it's just www.katmaitrophlodge.com.
Okay, there you have it. Don't be afraid to reach out to us too if you have questions. I'm glad to help you out and answer any questions I can about both locations, and we'll go from there. We'll see you next time. Go check out the website at www.ffipodcast.com.